At 62, I work as a maid. One day, I secretly brought my orphaned granddaughter to the mansion where I clean. When she saw a billionaire guest, she suddenly screamed, "Look, that's Mommy's watch!" I looked at his wrist and froze. I confronted him. His face went pale. He dropped to his knees and asked my granddaughter, "What was your mother's name?" When she answered, he broke down in tears. From that moment, everything changed. I'm really glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story travels. My name is Ethel, and at 62 years old, I never imagined a child's scream would shatter everything I thought I knew about my life. But that Tuesday morning in March, when my 8-year-old granddaughter Veda pointed at something that shouldn't have existed, our world split open. I'd been working as a housekeeper for the Whitmore family for 3 years. $500 a week to scrub their marble floors, dust their crystal chandeliers, and pretend I didn't exist whenever they entertained their wealthy friends. It wasn't the life I'd once dreamed of. But after my daughter Sarah died 7 years earlier, leaving me with a newborn to raise alone, dignity became a luxury I could no longer afford. That morning started like any other. I dropped Veda off at school and arrived at the mansion around 7:30. The house always smelled like expensive furniture polish and fresh flowers, a sharp contrast to our cramped apartment, which usually carried the scent of the neighbors' cooking and had heating that only worked when it felt like it. Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper, barely glanced up when I signed in. "The master bedroom needs extra attention today," she said in a clipped tone, the kind of authority that comes from never having scrubbed a toilet herself. "Mr. Whitmore has guests coming for lunch." I nodded and gathered my supplies. Jonathan Whitmore was rarely home during my shifts, which suited me just fine. The few times I'd seen him, he'd struck me as the kind of man who looked right through people like me, as if we were part of the furniture. Tall, silver-haired, with the easy confidence of someone who never had to worry about rent, medical bills, or the price of groceries. I was halfway through polishing the master bathroom when my phone rang. Veda's school. My heart jumped into my throat, the way it always did when they called. "Mrs. Morgan, Veda has a fever," the nurse said. "You'll need to pick her up." I closed my eyes and did the math in my head. If I left now, I'd lose half a day's pay. But Veda had been fighting a cold all week, and with her asthma, I couldn't take any risks. I found Mrs. Henderson and explained the situation. "You can't just leave in the middle of your shift," she said, her face tightening in disapproval. "She's sick. She's 8 years old and has asthma," I insisted. Mrs. Henderson sighed dramatically. "Fine, but this better not become a habit. Take her to the staff room until you're finished, and keep her quiet." The staff room was barely bigger than a closet, tucked behind the kitchen with no windows and furniture that looked like it had been rescued from a garage sale. But it was still better than leaving Veda alone at home, feverish and struggling to breathe. I picked her up from school and brought her back with me, settling her on the old couch with her worn stuffed rabbit and a book. "Stay here, sweetheart," I whispered, smoothing her damp forehead. "Grandma just needs to finish cleaning, and then we'll go home." Veda nodded sleepily. She'd always been good about staying put when I had to bring her to work. In the quiet, resigned way children sometimes understand what adults don't say out loud, she knew we needed this job, that those $500 a week kept a roof over our heads, paid for her medication, and bought the food on our table. I went back to my duties, working faster than usual. The lunch guests would arrive soon, and everything had to be perfect. I was buffing water spots off the dining room mirrors when I heard voices in the foyer. Mr. Whitmore was greeting his guests, his smooth, practiced charm carrying easily through the house, the kind of voice that probably opened both doors and bank accounts. I kept my head down and continued working. Being invisible was the key to keeping jobs like this. Work hard, stay quiet, and never give anyone a reason to notice you, unless they absolutely had to. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A child's voice, high and clear, unmistakably Veda's. Grandma, where are you?" My heart stopped. She was supposed to stay in the staff room. I dropped the cloth and hurried toward the sound, but I was too late. By the time I reached the main hallway, Veda was already standing there in her wrinkled school uniform and mismatched socks, staring up at a small group of well-dressed men with wide, fever-bright eyes. "I'm so sorry," I began, rushing forward to pull her back. "She's not feeling well, and—" But Veda didn't move. She was staring at something with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Not fear, not confusion. Recognition, pure, shocked recognition. "That's Mommy's watch," she said, her little voice slicing through the polite conversation like a knife. The words hit me like a physical blow. I followed her gaze. There, on Jonathan Whitmore's wrist, was a gold vintage watch with an intricate face and a leather band. A watch I had seen 1,000 times before in the photographs I kept of my daughter. The same watch Sarah wore in every picture from the last year of her life. "What did you say?" Mr. Whitmore's voice was different now, sharp, controlled, careful. Veda stepped closer, completely unaware of the sudden tension in the room. "That's my mommy's watch," she said. "She wore it every day. Grandma has pictures." The world tilted. That watch was distinctive, antique, with tiny diamonds framing the face. It wasn't the kind of piece you picked up in a random jewelry store. There was only one possible explanation for why Jonathan Whitmore was wearing it, and that thought made my legs feel like they might give out. "Veda," I whispered, reaching for her hand. "Come with Grandma." But she pulled away, eyes still locked on the watch. "Where did you get Mommy's watch?" she asked. "Did you know her? Did you know my mommy?" The silence that followed was suffocating. I could feel the guests' eyes on us, their discomfort hanging in the air like thick fog, but I didn't look at them. My gaze stayed locked on Jonathan Whitmore's face, and what I saw there confirmed my worst fear. He knew, he absolutely knew what that watch meant. His face had drained of color, and his hand moved instinctively to cover the watch on his wrist. "I don't know what she's talking about," he said, but his voice was tight, strained. "That's a very unusual watch," one of his guests added lightly, clearly trying to diffuse the tension. "Family heirloom? Something like that?" "Family heirloom," Jonathan repeated. "Something like that." But he wasn't looking at his friend. His eyes were fixed on Veda, then on me, with a mixture of guilt, fear, and something else I couldn't yet name. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said quickly, tightening my grip on Veda's hand. "We should go." But Veda wasn't done. "It has a crack right there," she said, pointing at the watch face. "From when Mommy dropped it on the bathroom floor. She cried because she said it was important. She said someone special gave it to her." Jonathan's hand was trembling now. Even from across the room I could see it, and in that moment I knew beyond any doubt that this man hadn't just known my daughter. He had loved her, and then he had broken her heart. The rest of the afternoon blurred into a strange performance of fake normalcy, like I'd been dropped into a play without a script. I got Veda back to the staff room, but my hands shook so badly it was hard to finish my tasks. Every few minutes I would stop, staring at nothing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Sarah's watch, on Jonathan Whitmore's wrist, in the mansion where I'd been scrubbing his floors and washing his dishes for 3 years, never knowing he had been part of my daughter's life. Veda eventually fell asleep on the couch, worn out from her fever and the strange, emotionally charged moment in the hallway. I watched her small chest rise and fall and thought about all the times she'd asked about her mother, about her father, about why it was just the two of us. I had always told her that some stories were too sad to tell yet, that when she was older, I would explain. But the truth was, I hadn't had all the answers myself. In those last months before Veda was born, Sarah had become secretive. She stopped talking about the man she was seeing. The light had gone out of her eyes little by little. She was withdrawn, sad in a way that frightened me, and then she died, taking most of her secrets with her. By 5 o'clock, the lunch guests were gone, and the mansion had settled into its usual afternoon quiet. Mrs. Henderson dismissed me with a curt tone, clearly displeased by the disruption earlier. I gathered my things and was about to wake Veda when I heard footsteps in the hallway outside the staff room. "Mrs. Morgan?" Jonathan's voice came through the door. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" My stomach clenched. I'd hoped to slip out without facing him again, to have a night to think, to breathe. But he wasn't going to allow that. I opened the door. He stood there still in his perfectly tailored suit, probably worth more than 6 months of my wages, but the polished image was cracked now. His face was drawn, and there were new lines etched around his eyes that I hadn't noticed before. "Your granddaughter," he began, then faltered. "The watch she mentioned. Could you tell me about it?" I glanced back at Veda, still sleeping on the couch, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. "What do you want to know?" I asked. "She said it belonged to her mother. You have photographs?" The careful way he chose his words told me everything. He wasn't just curious. He wasn't making polite conversation. He was afraid. "I do," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Plenty of them. Sarah wore that watch every single day for the last 2 years of her life. She said it was a gift from someone she loved." Something flickered in his expression at the sound of my daughter's name. "Sarah?" he repeated quietly. "Sarah Elizabeth Morgan." "She died 7 years ago," I said, 3 days after Veda was born. Complications from the delivery. I watched his face closely. She was 29, beautiful, and terrified. Terrified because the man who gave her that watch disappeared right when she needed him the most. Jonathan flinched as if I'd slapped him. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said. "Has there?" I stepped closer, lowering my voice so I wouldn't wake Veda. "Because my granddaughter has been looking at photos of that watch her entire life. She knows every scratch, every mark, and now here you are, wearing it, acting like you've never seen it before. Mrs. Morgan, I understand you're upset." Upset? 8 years of grief and anger surged up in my chest all at once. "Do you have any idea what it's been like raising that little girl alone?" I hissed. "Working jobs like this just to keep food on the table, never knowing why her father walked away?" His face was paper white now. "I don't know anything about a father," he said. But even as the words left his mouth, the lie was screaming from his eyes. The guilt was there in the way he wouldn't quite look at me, in the slight tremor of his hands at his sides. "Where did you get the watch?" I asked, no longer bothering to hide the steel in my voice. "It's been in my family for years," he said. "That's not true." I took out my phone and opened the photo album where I kept Sarah's pictures. "Look at this." I held up a photo taken just months before Veda was born. Sarah was sitting in our old kitchen, laughing at something off camera. The watch was clearly visible on her wrist. Jonathan stared at the picture for a long time. When he finally looked up, his eyes were full of something that looked a lot like pain. "She was beautiful," he said quietly. "Yes," I replied. "She was, and she loved someone deeply. Someone who gave her that watch and then shattered her heart. Someone who left her pregnant and alone. I never—" He started, then stopped himself. "You never what?" I pressed. He was silent for so long that I thought he might refuse to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely more than a whisper. "I never knew about the baby." The words hung in the air between us like a weight. My knees nearly buckled, and I had to brace myself against the doorframe. All those years of questions, of trying to imagine what kind of man could abandon my daughter. And here he was, standing in front of me, wearing her watch, claiming he hadn't known about the child she died bringing into this world. "You never knew," I repeated, the words bitter on my tongue. "Or you never wanted to know." "Mrs. Morgan, I understand you're angry, but this is complicated." "Complicated?" My voice rose despite my effort to stay calm. "My daughter cried herself to sleep for months after you left. She wouldn't tell me what happened, but I watched her heart break a little more every single day, and then when she found out she was pregnant—" I stopped, remembering those dark days when Sarah could barely get out of bed. "I didn't know," he said again. But there was something in his tone that told me the truth was more complicated than simple ignorance. "But you knew her," I insisted. "You gave her that watch." He nodded slowly. "Yes." "And then you disappeared." Another nod, even more reluctant. "Why?" He glanced toward the staff room where Veda was still sleeping, then looked back at me. "I was engaged to someone else," he said. "Someone my family expected me to marry. Sarah knew that from the beginning." The casual way he said it, as if my daughter's heartbreak had been an acceptable side effect of his carefully managed life, made rage flare in my chest. "So what was she then?" I snapped. "A distraction? Something to amuse you until your real life started?" "It wasn't like that." "Then what was it like?" I demanded. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you used my daughter and threw her away when she became inconvenient." Jonathan dragged a hand through his silver hair, and for the first time, he actually looked his age. "I cared about her," he said quietly, "more than I should have. But I had obligations, commitments made long before I met Sarah. And she had a baby. Your baby. Where were your obligations to her?" "I told you I didn't know." "Stop saying that," I snapped, then immediately glanced at Veda, relieved to see she was still asleep. "You may not have known she was pregnant, but you did know you were abandoning someone who loved you. You knew you were taking that watch, something that clearly meant the world to her, and walking away." His jaw tightened. "I didn't take anything," he said. "I gave her that watch. It was mine to give." "And apparently yours to take back," I shot back. "She returned it to me." The words hit me like a punch. "What?" "The day I told her about my engagement," he said quietly, "she gave the watch back and told me she never wanted to see me again." I stared at him, trying to process this new piece of information. In every photo I had of Sarah from that last year, she was wearing that watch. If she had returned it to him. "When did you see her last?" I asked. 8 years ago, maybe 9. But that didn't add up. Veda was 8, and Sarah had been wearing that watch when she was born. I had the hospital photos. Sarah's wrist, the bracelet, and the watch, burned into my memory. "That's impossible," I said flatly. "She had that watch when Veda was born. I have pictures." Something shifted in Jonathan's expression. "Are you sure it was the same watch?" he asked. "Absolutely sure. My granddaughter recognized every detail." A long silence stretched between us. I could see the wheels turning in his mind as he tried to fit this into the version of events he believed was true. "Mr. Whitmore," I said slowly, "I think there are things about my daughter's last months that neither of us understands." He nodded, his face grim. "I think you might be right." The next 3 days passed in a strange kind of limbo. On the surface, life went on as usual. I took Veda to school, cleaned other people's houses in the neighborhood, cooked dinner with whatever was discounted at the grocery store. But my mind never left that hallway conversation with Jonathan. He had known my daughter. He had loved her in his way. And somewhere in the timeline I thought I understood, there were gaps, missing pieces that didn't make sense. On Friday afternoon, I was folding laundry in our cramped living room while Veda worked on her homework at the kitchen table. My phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something made me answer. "Mrs. Morgan, this is Jonathan Whitmore. Could we meet somewhere private? I have some information I think you need to hear." My first instinct was to hang up. I had spent 3 days trying to shove that conversation to the back of my mind, focusing on the life I'd built for Veda and me. Getting tangled up in whatever guilt or confusion Jonathan was dealing with felt dangerous, a distraction that could cost me everything. But then I looked at Veda, hunched over her math problems with a fierce concentration that reminded me so much of Sarah, and I knew I couldn't simply walk away. If there were answers about her father, about why Sarah had been so broken in those last months, I owed it to both of them to find out. "Where?" I asked. "There's a diner on Maple Street near the hospital, Murphy's. Could you meet me there at 7? I arranged for Mrs. Chen from next door to watch Veda, telling her I had a work emergency. It wasn't entirely a lie. My livelihood depended on my job at the Whitmore house, and this conversation might very well determine what happened next. Murphy's Diner was the kind of place that looked like it hadn't changed since 1975. Cracked vinyl booths, sticky tables, and harsh fluorescent lights that made everyone look a bit washed out. Jonathan was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with a cup of coffee that looked untouched. He'd traded his expensive suit for jeans and a sweater, but he still looked out of place among the hospital staff and working-class families eating their dinners. "Thank you for coming," he said as I slid into the seat across from him. "You said you had information," I replied. He nodded and reached into the messenger bag beside him. I spent the last 2 days going through old papers, trying to piece together the timeline we talked about. I found these. He placed a small stack of envelopes on the table between us. They were addressed to him in handwriting I recognized immediately, Sarah's neat, careful cursive. The same writing that had filled birthday cards, notes on the fridge, grocery lists. "She wrote to you," I whispered. "For months after we broke up," he said. "The first few were angry, which I deserved. I hurt her deeply. But then they changed." He picked one envelope from the stack. This one came about 6 months after I told her about my engagement. My hands trembled as I opened it and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. "You never knew," I repeated, tasting the bitterness in every word. "Or you never wanted to know. Mrs. Morgan, I understand that you're angry, but this is complicated." "Complicated?" My voice rose despite my effort to stay calm. "My daughter cried herself to sleep for months after you left. She wouldn't tell me exactly what happened, but I watched her break a little more every day. And then, when she found out she was pregnant," I stopped, remembering those dark days when Sarah could barely drag herself out of bed. "I didn't know," he said again. But there was something in his voice that told me the truth wasn't as simple as that. "But you knew her," I insisted. "You gave her that watch." He nodded slowly. "Yes." "And then you vanished." He nodded again, even more reluctantly. "Why?" He glanced toward the staff room where Veda was still sleeping, then back at me. "I was engaged to someone else," he said. "Someone my family expected me to marry. Sarah knew that from the beginning." The casual way he said it, as if my daughter's heartbreak was just collateral damage in his carefully arranged life, made my blood boil. "So what was she?" I demanded. "A distraction? Something to keep you entertained until your real life started?" "It wasn't like that," he said. "Then what was it like?" I shot back. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you used my daughter and threw her away when she became inconvenient." Jonathan dragged a hand through his silver hair, and for the first time since I'd met him, he actually looked his age. "I cared about her," he said quietly. "More than I should have, but I had obligations, commitments that existed long before I met Sarah. And she had a baby. Your baby. Where were your obligations then?" "I told you. I didn't know." "Stop saying that," I snapped, then quickly checked that Veda was still asleep. "Maybe you didn't know she was pregnant, but you did know you were walking away from a woman who loved you. You knew you were taking that watch, something she clearly cherished, and leaving her behind." His jaw clenched. "I didn't take anything," he said tightly. "I gave her that watch. It was mine to give." "And apparently yours to reclaim," I said coldly. "She gave it back to me." The words hit like a punch to the gut. "What?" "The day I told her about my engagement," he said quietly. "She handed me the watch, told me she never wanted to see me again." I stared at him, trying to fit that into everything I knew. In every photo I had of Sarah from that last year, she was wearing that watch. If she'd returned it— "When was the last time you saw her?" I asked. 8 years ago, maybe 9. That didn't line up. Veda was 8, and Sarah had that watch when Veda was born. I had the hospital photos burned into my memory, Sarah's wrist, the bracelet, and the watch. "That's impossible," I said flatly. "She still had that watch when Veda was born. I have pictures." Something in Jonathan's expression shifted. "Are you sure it was the same watch?" he asked. "I'm completely sure. My granddaughter recognized every mark on it." A long silence stretched between us. I could see him thinking, trying to reconcile his version of events with mine, and failing. "Mr. Whitmore," I said slowly, "I think there are things about my daughter's last months that neither of us understands." He nodded grimly. I think you're right. The next 3 days felt like living underwater. On the surface, my routine didn't change. I took Veda to school, cleaned houses in the neighborhood, cooked dinner with whatever was on sale that week. But in my mind, I was still standing in that hallway, replaying every word Jonathan and I had exchanged. He had known my daughter. He had loved her, in his own flawed way. And somewhere in the timeline I thought I understood, there were missing pieces that didn't fit. On Friday afternoon, I was folding laundry in our tiny living room while Veda worked on her homework at the kitchen table. My phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something told me to answer. "Mrs. Morgan, this is Jonathan Whitmore. Could we meet somewhere private? I have some information I think you need to hear." My first impulse was to hang up. I'd spent 3 days trying to push all of this to the back of my mind, focusing on the life I'd built for Veda and me. Getting tangled up in Jonathan's guilt and confusion felt dangerous, a distraction I couldn't afford. But then I looked at Veda, hunched over her math workbook with that same stubborn concentration Sarah used to have, and I knew I couldn't ignore this. If there were answers about her father, about why Sarah had been so broken in those last months, I owed it to both of them to find the truth. "Where?" I asked. "There's a diner on Maple Street near the hospital," he said. "Murphy's. Could you meet me there at 7? I arranged for Mrs. Chen from next door to watch Veda, telling her I had a work emergency. It wasn't entirely a lie. My job at the Whitmore mansion was my lifeline, and whatever came out of this conversation could change everything. Murphy's diner looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. Cracked vinyl booths, harsh fluorescent lights, and the faint smell of grease in the air. Jonathan was already seated when I walked in, tucked into a corner booth with a cup of coffee that he clearly hadn't touched. He wasn't wearing his usual expensive suit, just jeans and a sweater, but he still looked out of place among the nurses, orderlies, and working-class families. "Thank you for coming," he said as I slid into the seat across from him. "You said you had information," I replied. He nodded and reached into the messenger bag at his side. "I've spent the last 2 days going through old papers trying to piece together the timeline we talked about," he said. "I found these." He set a small stack of envelopes on the table between us. They were addressed to him in handwriting I recognized immediately, Sarah's neat, careful script, the same handwriting that had filled birthday cards and grocery lists. "She wrote to you," I whispered. "For months after we broke up," he said. At first, the letters were angry, which I understood. I'd hurt her badly. But then they changed. He pulled one envelope from the pile. This one came about 6 months after I told her about my engagement. My hands trembled as I opened it and unfolded the single page inside. "Jonathan, I know you probably throw these letters away without reading them, but I need to try one last time. I'm pregnant. The baby is due in March. I'm not asking you to leave Margaret or change your life. I just thought you should know. I still love you. I probably always will, but I finally understand that love isn't always enough. Sarah." The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. March. Veda had been born in March 8 years ago. "You got this letter?" I asked, looking up at him. "You knew she was pregnant." His face looked ashen under the fluorescent lights, as if he'd aged 10 years in an hour. "I never saw it," he said. "Back then, I had my secretary manage all my personal mail. I told her to return anything from Sarah unopened." "Your secretary?" I repeated hollowly. "Margaret and I were having problems," he continued. "She was suspicious about what had really happened with Sarah, asking questions I couldn't answer honestly. I thought the cleanest solution was to cut off contact completely." I stared at him, trying to grasp the enormity of what he was admitting. "So Sarah wrote to tell you she was carrying your child," I said slowly, "and you had the letter sent back without even reading it." "I didn't know what it said," he insisted. "I just knew that if I kept communicating with her, it would complicate everything." "Everything," I echoed. "You mean your comfortable life? Your respectable marriage?" "Yes," he said quietly. "That's exactly what I mean." There were more envelopes on the table. I picked up another and opened it. This one was dated 2 months later. Jonathan, I went to the doctor yesterday. The baby is healthy. It's a girl. I keep thinking about names, and I always come back to Victoria after your grandmother. You once told me she was the only person in your family who truly understood you. I bought a crib yesterday with money I've been saving. It isn't much, but it's sturdy. I keep imagining what she'll look like, whether she'll have your eyes or mine. I miss you so much it feels like drowning sometimes, but I'm trying to stay strong for her. Sarah. Victoria, I whispered. She was going to name the baby Victoria. Jonathan's hands were shaking now. My grandmother raised me after my parents died, he said quietly. She was the most important person in my life. But Veda's name isn't Victoria, I pointed out. It's Veda. Keep reading, he said. The next letter was dated just weeks before Sarah's due date. Jonathan, I saw your wedding announcement in the paper. You and Margaret looked beautiful. I hope you'll be happy. I've decided to name the baby Veda instead of Victoria. It means knowledge or wisdom in Sanskrit. I want her to be smarter than her parents, smart enough to know her worth and never settle for someone who can't choose her completely. This will be the last letter I write, I promise. But I wanted you to know that I forgive you. I don't understand your choice, but I forgive it. Sarah. I leaned back against the cracked vinyl, overwhelmed by the weight of my daughter's words. For years, I'd imagined Veda's father as some cold, heartless man who had used Sarah and tossed her aside, but the truth in front of me was more complicated. He hadn't been outright cruel. He had been weak. There's one more, Jonathan said softly. This envelope felt heavier. When I opened it, Sarah's hospital bracelet slid onto the table, the same one she'd worn when Veda was born. Jonathan, I know I said the last letter would truly be the last, but I lied. I'm in the hospital. There were complications, and the doctors aren't sure I'm going to make it. If something happens to me, I need you to know about your daughter. Her name is Veda Elizabeth Morgan. She was born on March 15th at 3:47 a.m. She weighs 6 pounds 4 ounces and she's perfect. I'm sending you my hospital bracelet so you'll know this isn't a game or some attempt to manipulate you. If you ever want to find her, her grandmother's name is Ethel Morgan and we live on Elm Street. I loved you, Jonathan. I loved you enough to let you go. Please love her enough to find her if I can't be here to raise her. With all my love, Sarah. The date on the bracelet was March 15th, 8 years ago, 3 days before Sarah died. You got this letter too? I asked, my voice hollow. 6 months after she mailed it, he said. My secretary had been holding on to all the letters thinking I'd eventually want to read them. By the time she finally gave them to me, Sarah was already gone. I looked at the man sitting across from me, wealthy, powerful, respected, and for the first time I saw him clearly, not as a monster, but as a coward whose choices had destroyed the woman I loved most in this world. So you did know, I said slowly. For 7.5 years, you knew you had a daughter, and you did nothing. I tried to find you, he replied. I hired investigators, but the address in the letter was wrong. You'd moved. We moved because I couldn't afford the rent after Sarah died, I said quietly. I had to take Veda and find somewhere cheaper. I know, he said. By the time we tracked down the right address, you'd already moved again, and then again. The investigator told me it would be almost impossible to find you without more information. I let out a bitter laugh. Impossible, I echoed. Do you have any idea how many nights I lay awake wondering if Veda's father even knew she existed? How many times she asked me why her daddy didn't want her? I'm sorry, he whispered. Sorry doesn't give me back 8 years, I said. And it doesn't give Veda a father for all the times she needed one. I know, he said quietly. We fell into silence. Around us, the diner went on as usual. The clink of cutlery, the murmur of conversations, the hiss of the grill. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, completely unaware that in one corner booth, everything I thought I knew about the last 8 years had just been shattered. The watch, I said at last. Explain the watch. Jonathan reached into his bag again and pulled out a small jewelry box. Sarah didn't give it back when we broke up, he said. She kept it, and according to these letters, she wore it every day until she died. Then how do you have it now? After I finally learned about the letters, he replied, I went to the hospital where she died. They had a box of her personal effects that no one had ever claimed. The watch was in there, along with some jewelry and the clothes she was wearing when she was admitted. The room seemed to tilt sideways. You went to the hospital and took her things, I whispered. I told them I was family. I wanted something of hers, something that connected me to the months I missed. You had no right, I said, my voice low and dangerous. Those were her things. They belonged to Veda. You're right, he said quietly. I stared at the jewelry box, thinking of all the nights Veda had stared at Sarah's photo albums, asking about the pretty watch her mother used to wear. All this time, it had been sitting in Jonathan Whitmore's house while we scraped by, counting pennies for rent and groceries. I want it back, I said. Of course. He pushed the box across the table. There are other things too, he added. A necklace, some rings. They're at the house. I opened the box and looked at the watch that had started everything. It seemed smaller than I remembered from the photos, more delicate, but it was unmistakably the same one, even down to the tiny crack Veda had pointed out. There's something else you should know, Jonathan said as I stared at the watch, about why I've been trying to find you all these years. I looked up and the expression on his face made my stomach twist. I'm dying, Mrs. Morgan, he said. Pancreatic cancer. I have maybe 6 months left. The words hung between us like smoke from a fire I couldn't put out. Dying. 6 months. I stared at him across the diner table, trying to reconcile that news with the anger that had been burning in me for days. That's why you're telling me all of this now, I said finally, because the guilt is eating you alive and you want to clear your conscience before you go. Partly, he admitted, but also because I want to do right by Veda, by Sarah's memory. I closed the jewelry box around the watch, my fingers tightening over it. What does that mean exactly? I want to provide for her, he said. College fund, medical expenses, whatever she needs. I need to update my will. The way he said it, smooth, practical, like he was discussing a donation to a charity instead of his own child, made something crack inside me. She doesn't need your money, I said sharply. She needs her father. I can't be her father, he replied. Not in the way she deserves. Why not? He ran a hand through his silver hair again, that nervous tick I'd already learned to recognize. My life is complicated, he said. Margaret and I never had children, but we have a certain social standing, obligations. The revelation that I have an 8-year-old daughter from an affair would destroy everything we've built. Everything you've built, I repeated slowly. And what about what Veda could build? What about her right to know where she comes from? She's better off without that burden, he insisted. Burden? The word came out like a slap. Is that what you think she is? A burden? That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? I pressed. Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you care more about your reputation than your daughter's well-being. Jonathan's jaw tightened. You don't understand the complexities, he said stiffly. Oh, I understand perfectly. I leaned forward, lowering my voice so the other diners wouldn't hear, but making sure every word hit home. You're a coward who hid behind his secretary for years, and now that you're dying, you want to throw money at the problem so you can feel better about yourself. That's not fair, he protested. Fair? I almost laughed. You want to talk about fair? Sarah worked 2 jobs while she was pregnant because she couldn't afford proper prenatal care. I've been cleaning houses for 12 years to keep food on the table and Veda in school. We've been living paycheck to paycheck while you sit in your mansion wearing her mother's watch. Don't you dare lecture me about fair. The silence that followed was charged and heavy. I could feel other customers glancing over, sensing the tension even if they didn't know the details. I know you're angry, Jonathan said at last. You have every right to be, but think about what's best for Veda, a secure financial future versus the chaos that would come from revealing the truth. The truth isn't chaos, I said. It's just the truth. My world would eat her alive, he replied. The media attention, the speculation about Margaret and me, the whispers at school. Is that really what you want for her? I thought of Veda asleep in her narrow bed in our tiny apartment, surrounded by secondhand furniture and the drawings she taped to the walls. She was bright, resilient, endlessly curious, but she was still just 8 years old and had never had a father. She asks about him, I said quietly. All the time. She's made up stories, says he's a soldier or a doctor or a teacher who had to go away for important work. She needs to know she wasn't abandoned because she wasn't good enough. She wasn't abandoned, he said quickly. I didn't know. But you do know now, I said, and you're choosing to abandon her all over again. Jonathan went pale. I'm trying to do what's right, he said. For who? I asked. For her or for you? He didn't answer. That silence was answer enough. I stood up, clutching the jewelry box so tightly my knuckles turned white. I want the rest of Sarah's things, I said, and I want you to stay away from us. Mrs. Morgan, please, he said, at least let me help her financially. We don't want your help, I cut in. We've managed just fine without you for 8 years, I said, and we'll keep managing just fine. But what about college, I'll figure it out, I cut him off, the same way I figured out everything else. I was already halfway to the door when his voice stopped me. What will you tell her about me? I turned back. For the first time since all of this began, I saw real pain in his eyes. Not guilt, not fear, actual heartbreak. Nothing, I said, because as far as Veda is concerned, you don't exist. The walk home felt endless. I kept Sarah's jewelry box tucked inside my jacket, its weight pressed against my ribs like a physical ache. By the time I reached our apartment building, I'd made a decision that felt both completely right and completely awful. Mrs. Chen was watching television when I knocked on her door to pick up Veda. How was she? I asked as Veda grabbed her backpack and homework. Perfect, as always, Mrs. Chen smiled. Did your work emergency get sorted out? I nodded, not trusting myself to explain the lie any further. Back in our apartment, we slipped into our familiar evening routine, brushing teeth, reading a story, making sure her inhaler was on the nightstand within easy reach. She chattered about her day at school, a test she was nervous about, a boy who'd been mean to a friend, normal 8-year-old problems I knew how to help her with. Grandma, she said as I was tucking her in, remember that man with Mommy's watch? My stomach tightened. What about him? Do you think he really knew her? I sat on the edge of her bed and brushed her dark hair away from her face. She had Sarah's deep brown searching eyes, but her nose was smaller, more angular, Jonathan's nose. I don't know, sweetheart, I said softly. Sometimes people just have similar things. But it had the crack, she insisted. The exact same crack. Maybe there's more than one watch like that, I said. Veda frowned, clearly unconvinced. Could you ask him next time you see him at work? The innocence in that question nearly broke me. She had no idea that her simple observation had shaken my entire understanding of her father. To her, it was just a mystery she hoped her grandma could solve. We'll see, I said, kissing her forehead. Sleep now. After she drifted off, I sat at the kitchen table with the jewelry box open in front of me. Inside were the watch, a thin gold chain with Sarah's initial, and a small diamond ring I remembered her wearing on her right hand. Simple pieces, nothing extravagant, but they were hers. I picked up the watch and turned it in the lamplight. The face was a soft cream color with delicate Roman numerals, and the crack Veda had mentioned ran from the 6 to the 8 like a tiny lightning bolt. I remembered the day she'd dropped it. She was about 7 months pregnant, tired and clumsy from carrying Veda. When the watch hit the bathroom tiles, she'd sobbed for 20 minutes. It was his grandmother's, she'd told me through tears. It's probably worth more than everything else I own. But she'd refused to get it repaired, said it would be too expensive and she couldn't risk making it worse. So she wore it with the crack for the last 2 months of her life. Now I finally understood why. It wasn't just about money, it was about clinging to the last physical piece of the man she loved, even if he'd chosen someone else. My phone rang, jolting me out of my thoughts. I almost ignored it when I saw an unknown number, but something made me answer. "Mrs. Morgan, it's Jonathan. Please don't hang up." "I told you to stay away from us," I said. "I know, and I will. But there's something else you need to know about my will." "I don't care about your will. I'm leaving everything to Veda." The words hit me like a blow. "What?" "The house, the investments, everything," he said. "Margaret and I have been separated for 3 years. We just haven't gone public with it. She has her own family money. Veda is my only heir." I sank into a chair, the phone pressed tight against my ear. "How much money are we talking about?" I asked. "Approximately $200 million. The number was so huge it didn't feel real. 200 million. More money than I could ever dream of spending in 10 lifetimes. "She can't inherit that kind of money at 8 years old," I said weakly. "It would be held in trust until she's 25, he explained. "With you as the trustee, you'd have complete control over how it's used for her benefit." I thought about our $800 rent, about the nights I lay awake juggling numbers in my head, trying to decide whether we could afford her asthma medication and groceries in the same week. About the second-hand clothes, the broken heater the landlord refused to fix. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered. "Because it's the only thing I can do," he said. "I can't be her father, but I can make sure she never wants for anything." "Money isn't everything," I said. "No," he replied quietly. "But it's something. And it's the only something I have left to give." After I hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time, watching the streetlight bleed through our thin curtains, listening to the steady rhythm of Veda's breathing from the bedroom. In a few months, Jonathan Whitmore would be dead, and my granddaughter would be one of the richest little girls in the state, but she still wouldn't have a father. She still wouldn't have the answers to the questions that kept her awake some nights, the ones about why she was different from the other kids whose dads came to school plays and helped with science projects. The money would change our circumstances, but it wouldn't change the fact that the man who was her father had chosen his comfortable life over her, just as he had once chosen it over her mother. I picked up Sarah's watch again, tracing the thin crack that had never been repaired. Some things, once broken, could never truly be fixed. Some absences could never be filled, no matter how much money you tried to pour into the empty space they left behind. But the money would mean Veda could go to any college she wanted. It would mean she could chase her dreams without the constant, grinding fear of not having enough, fear that had shaped every choice I'd ever made as an adult. It would mean she'd have options Sarah never had, opportunities I could never give her on a housekeeper's wages. As much as I despised Jonathan Whitmore for his cowardice, I couldn't bring myself to hate this final act, his last attempt to do something for his daughter. Even if it was soaked in guilt and came far too late to matter in the ways that truly counted. 3 weeks passed in uneasy quiet. I went back to the Whitmore mansion and worked as if nothing had changed, cleaning the same rooms, following the same schedule, but everything felt different now. I couldn't step into his study without thinking about those letters Sarah had written. I couldn't vacuum the hallway where Veda had first seen the watch without remembering the look of raw guilt on Jonathan's face. He was rarely home during my shifts anyway. Mrs. Henderson mentioned he was spending more time at doctor's appointments, but she said it in the same tone you'd use for car maintenance, not a man staring down his own mortality. I'd told Veda that I'd spoken to the man with the watch and that he'd confirmed it wasn't her mother's. "Just a similar model," I said. She'd accepted my answer with that particular resilience children have when they know adults are closing a door on a topic. The explanation didn't fully convince her, but it told her the discussion was over. The real watch sat in my own jewelry box at home, wrapped carefully in one of Sarah's old scarves. I still hadn't decided what to do with it. Wearing it felt wrong, like stealing something that belonged to my daughter's memory. But leaving it hidden away felt just as wrong, like denying the bond it represented. One Thursday afternoon in early April, I was reorganizing the linen closet when Mrs. Henderson found me. Her usually stiff expression was softened by something that looked uncomfortably like pity. "Mrs. Morgan, I need to speak with you about your schedule," she said. I set down the stack of folded towels. Is there a problem? Mr. Whitmore is quite ill, she said. He's asked me to reduce the household staff temporarily. I'm sorry, but we won't be needing your services for the foreseeable future. The words hit like a blow to the chest. $500 a week. Gone. Without that income, we'd have to move again, find somewhere even cheaper. Veda would have to switch schools, leave the friends she'd finally made. I see, I managed. Do you need me to finish out the week? Today will be your last day, she said. Mr. Whitmore asked me to give you this. She handed me an envelope with my name written on it in a neat, unfamiliar hand. Inside was a check for $2,000, 4 weeks severance, and a short note. Mrs. Morgan, I hope you'll understand that this decision has nothing to do with your work, which has always been excellent. I wish you and Veda all the best. J. Whitmore. I stared at the check, trying to absorb it. He was cutting me off, removing me from his life before things deteriorated further. It was probably for the best, I told myself. A clean break. No more complications. But as I gathered my supplies and walked through the mansion one last time, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't only about his health. This was about fear. Fear of what might happen if he saw too much of Veda. Fear of her questions. Fear that the fragile walls of his carefully curated life might finally crack. 2 days later, I was at our kitchen table, combing through job listings, when my phone rang. The number looked familiar, but it took a second to place it. Mrs. Morgan, this is Dr. Patricia Reeves. I'm Mr. Whitmore's oncologist. He's asked me to contact you. My heart lurched. Is he all right? He's in the hospital, she said. His condition has worsened more quickly than we expected. He's asking to see you and your granddaughter. He says it's urgent. I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tighter. Dr. Reeves, I don't think that's a good idea, I said. Veda doesn't know anything about their connection, and I don't want to confuse her. I understand your concerns, she replied gently. But I need to be honest with you, Mrs. Morgan. Mr. Whitmore may not have much time left. Days, not weeks. He seems very distressed about something involving your granddaughter, and in my experience, patients with unfinished business often struggle more at the end. What kind of unfinished business? He mentioned letters, legal documents that need to be signed. He said you'd understand. I did understand. The will. The $200 million that would change Veda's life forever. But accepting that money meant acknowledging Jonathan as her father, and I still wasn't sure I was ready or willing to open that door. Where is he? I asked quietly. St. Mary's Hospital, she said. Room 412. Mrs. Morgan, if you're going to come, please come soon. I hung up and stared at the wall, my thoughts racing. Veda was at school and wouldn't be home for another 3 hours. I could go to the hospital, sign whatever he needed me to sign, and be back before she even knew I'd left. Keep it simple. Keep it clean. Keep her out of the emotional disaster zone that came with a dying father who had never wanted to know her when it mattered. But as I grabbed my purse and headed for the door, I couldn't shake the memory of Veda's face when she'd seen that watch. The awe in her eyes, the spark of hope in her voice. Maybe she deserved the truth, even if it was messy and painful. 30 minutes later, I was standing outside room 412 at St. Mary's Hospital. Through the partially open door, I saw Jonathan hooked up to machines, his skin ashen, his breathing shallow and strained. He looked nothing like the confident, impeccably dressed man I'd spent 3 years cleaning up after. He looked fragile, mortal, afraid. I tapped lightly on the doorframe. Mr. Whitmore? His eyes fluttered open, and when he saw me, relief washed over his face. Ethel, thank you for coming. It was the first time he had ever used my first name. Dr. Reeves said you needed to see me, I replied. I do. Please, sit down. I pulled a chair closer to the bed but stayed standing, my hands wrapped tightly around the strap of my purse. What is this about, Jonathan? I've been thinking about what you said at the diner, he answered, his voice rough. About Veda needing to know who her father is. I thought you made your feelings very clear on that, I said. He shifted, trying to sit up straighter, and winced with the effort. I was wrong, he said. I've been wrong about a lot of things. What changed your mind? I had a dream about Sarah, he said quietly. She was holding Veda as a baby, and she looked at me and said, "She's going to spend her whole life wondering why you didn't choose her." He paused, fighting for breath. When I woke up, I realized that's exactly what I've been doing, choosing my comfort, my reputation, over my daughter's need to know where she comes from. I felt something loosen, just a little, in the wall of anger I'd built around my heart, a hairline crack. "It's a little late for that realization, don't you think?" I said. "Yes," he admitted, "but not too late to try to do something about it." "What is it you want to do?" "I want to meet her," he said. "Really meet her. I want her to know who I am before I die." I studied his face, searching it for sincerity. "And then what?" I asked. "You get your big deathbed confession. She gets to say goodbye to a father she never knew she had, and I get to pick up the pieces after you're gone. That sounds incredibly selfish." "I know how it sounds," he said, "but Ethel, I've spent the last 3 weeks learning everything I can about you and Veda. I know about her grades, her interests, that she wants to be a veterinarian. I know you've been saving for years to buy her a bicycle for her 9th birthday. I know she's been asking for piano lessons and you can't afford them." The idea that he had been watching us from afar should have felt like an intrusion. Instead, it felt like something I never expected from him. It felt like care. "How do you know all that?" I asked. "I hired someone to do a background check," he said. "Not to invade your privacy, but because I wanted to understand the life she has. What kind of person she's becoming without me." "And what did you find?" "I found a little girl who is smart and kind and resilient," he said. "I found a grandmother who has sacrificed everything to give her the best life possible, and I found myself wishing I'd been part of that." The strength drained out of me, and I sank into the chair. "Jonathan, even if I agreed, how am I supposed to explain this to her?" I asked. "Veda, this is your father. He's been alive your entire life, but chose not to be around until now. You realize that could destroy her, don't you?" "We don't have to start there," he said. "Maybe you could bring her to visit me as a family friend. Let her get to know me a little before we tell her the truth." "And then," I demanded, "she bonds with you just in time to watch you die." The bluntness of it made him flinch, but he didn't look away. "Maybe," he said. "But isn't a short time with her father better than no time at all?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "Is it?" We sat in silence for a long moment, the only sounds the steady beeping of the monitors and the muted noise of the hospital corridor outside. Finally, Jonathan reached toward his bedside table. "I want to show you something," he said. He handed me a photograph. It was recent, clearly taken from a distance with a long lens. Veda and I were walking out of her school. She had her backpack on, her face animated as she told me something, and I was looking down at her, smiling, my hand resting on her shoulder. "When was this taken?" I asked. "Last week. The investigator took it to confirm her identity for the will," he said. "But when I saw it, I couldn't stop staring at it. She looks so much like Sarah. But there's something else, too. In her eyes, in the shape of her face." "She looks like you," I said quietly. "Yes," he replied. "And when I saw that, it finally hit me that she isn't just Sarah's daughter. She's mine, too. I've already missed 8 years of her life. I can't get those years back, but I can try to make whatever time I have left mean something." I studied the photo again, seeing Veda through her father's eyes for the first time. The resemblance was subtle, but once you knew where to look, it was undeniable. "If I agree to this," I said slowly, "there have to be conditions." "Anything," he said. "First, we go slowly," I said. "You don't get to dump the truth on her all at once and then vanish. If you're going to be in her life, no matter how briefly, you have to think about what that will do to her emotionally." "I understand," he said. "Second," I continued, "if at any point I decide this is hurting her more than it's helping, we stop. No arguing, no bargaining." "Agreed." "Third, the money stays out of it," I said, "at least until she's old enough to really understand what it means. She doesn't need to know about the inheritance while she's grieving. Jonathan nodded slowly. Those are fair conditions. I looked at the photograph one more time, then handed it back to him. I'll bring her tomorrow after school, I said. But Jonathan, if you break her heart the way you broke her mother's, I will make sure she forgets you ever existed. For the first time since I'd walked into the room, he smiled. It was faint, worn down by pain and medication, but it was real. Thank you, Ethel, he said, for giving me this chance. As I left the hospital, it hit me just how completely my life, and Veda's, was about to change. In trying to protect her from the truth about her father, I had kept her from even the possibility of knowing him. Now I was about to give her both, the gift and the burden of that truth. I could only hope I was making the right choice. Grandma, why are we visiting someone in the hospital? Veda asked as we walked through the automatic doors of St. Mary's. She was wearing her best dress, the navy blue one with tiny flowers I'd found at a thrift store 6 months ago, and clutching a drawing she'd made in art class that afternoon. Mr. Whitmore is very sick, I explained, my heart pounding harder with every step toward the elevator. He's someone Grandma used to work for, and he doesn't have any family to visit him. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it definitely wasn't the whole truth. I had spent most of the previous night lying awake, rehearsing different ways to explain all of this to an 8-year-old who had no idea her world was about to shift. Is he the man with Mommy's watch? She asked as we stepped into the elevator. I pressed the button for the 4th floor, buying myself a few seconds. Yes, sweetheart, I said. He is, and it really wasn't Mommy's watch. It's complicated. Complicated had become my go-to answer whenever she asked questions I wasn't ready to fully answer. Room 412 felt different this time. Jonathan had clearly prepared for our visit. His hair was combed, his hospital gown was clean, and someone had placed a small vase of flowers on the bedside table. When we walked in, his eyes went straight to Veda. I watched his face change, soften, in an instant. It was like watching someone see Sarah for the first time all over again. The same wonder, the same sudden, fierce tenderness, the same recognition that this little person was precious and irreplaceable. Hello, he said softly, his voice gentler than I had ever heard it. You must be Veda. She nodded, suddenly shy in that way children get around strangers in hospital rooms. Grandma says you're sick, she said. I am, he replied, but I'm feeling much better now that you're here to visit me. Veda looked around the room, studying the machines and monitors with open curiosity. Does it hurt? Sometimes, he admitted. But the doctors give me medicine that helps. Oh, she held up her drawing, a stick-figure family standing in front of a house with an enormous sun shining above them. I made this for you. Grandma said you don't have family to visit. Jonathan's eyes filled with tears as he took the picture from her. This is beautiful, Veda. Thank you so much. That's me and Grandma, she explained, pointing to the 2 figures holding hands. And that's our apartment building. It's not very big, but we like it. It looks perfect, he said, studying the drawing as if it were a priceless painting. Where do you go to school? Roosevelt Elementary, she said proudly. I'm in 3rd grade. My teacher's name is Mrs. Patterson, and she says I'm really good at math. That's wonderful, Jonathan said. Math was always my favorite subject, too. I watched the conversation unfold, amazed at how naturally they slipped into it. Jonathan asked about her friends, her favorite books, her dreams. Veda told him about wanting to be a veterinarian, about the stray cat she fed behind our apartment building, about how she was saving her allowance to buy food and toys for it. After about 30 minutes, I could see he was getting tired. His eyelids drooped slightly, and his breaths came a bit heavier, though he was clearly fighting to stay present for her. Sweetheart, I said gently, maybe we should let Mr. Whitmore rest now. But I want to ask him about the watch, she said, turning back to Jonathan with the straightforward focus only children seem to have. Jonathan looked at me, and I gave a slight nod. We had agreed he could acknowledge knowing Sarah, just not the full truth of their relationship. The watch belonged to someone very special to me, he said carefully, a woman named Sarah. She was beautiful and kind, just like you. Veda's eyes widened. That was my mommy's name, she said. Sarah Elizabeth Morgan. I know, he said softly. Your mother and I were friends a long time ago. Did you love her? The question was so simple and so direct that it stole my breath. I opened my mouth to step in, to steer things away from territory too painful and complicated, but Jonathan lifted a hand slightly, asking me to let him answer. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, he said slowly. Sometimes they think they're doing what's best, but they're wrong. I made a very big mistake with your mother, and I've regretted it every day since. Veda thought about this with a seriousness that made her look older than 8. Grandma says Mommy went to heaven when I was born, she said. She did, Jonathan replied. And I'd bet she's watching over you right now, very proud of the amazing little girl you've become. Do you think she's mad at you for your mistake? Jonathan's composure finally broke. Tears slipped down his cheeks as he looked at her, his child, asking him out loud the questions that had haunted him in silence for years. I hope she's forgiven me, he whispered. Veda studied his face, trying to read him the way children do when they're learning how adults' emotions work. Then, without warning, she climbed up onto the hospital bed and wrapped her arms around him. I forgive you, she said simply. If Mommy loved you, then you must be good. Jonathan's arms closed around her, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in existence. And in that moment I realized she was his daughter, and this was the first time he had ever held her. I turned away to give them their moment, and before I realized it, I was crying for the first time since this whole complicated ordeal began. Not from anger, not from grief exactly, but from something softer, something that felt a lot like healing. Over the next 2 weeks, we visited Jonathan every day after school. Veda brought her homework to show him, read him stories from her favorite books, and bombarded him with questions about everything, from his childhood to whether he thought dogs were better than cats. Little by little, we began to tell her more of the truth. We told her that Jonathan had loved her mother very much, but that he'd been too afraid to stay, that he'd made choices he regretted, but those choices didn't mean he hadn't cared, that sometimes love alone isn't enough to overcome fear, pressure, and circumstance. It was during one of those visits that Veda, with the innocent clarity only a child can have, asked the question that changed everything. If you're Mommy's friend and you loved her, she said, does that make you kind of like my daddy? The room went silent. Jonathan looked at me, quietly asking for permission to tell her the truth. I thought about all the years I'd spent shielding her from that truth. All the nights she had cried because she didn't have a father like the other kids. All the questions I'd dodged because I was sure the truth would hurt more than not knowing. Yes, sweetheart, I said softly. That's exactly what it makes him. Veda looked from me to Jonathan and back again, trying the idea on like a new coat. So you're my daddy? She asked him, carefully testing the word. If you want me to be, he said quietly. She thought about that for a long moment. I always wanted a daddy, she admitted. But I thought daddies were supposed to live with their kids and help them with homework and come to school plays. You're right, Jonathan said. That is what daddies are supposed to do. I can't live with you or help with your homework every day, but I can love you with all my heart, for whatever time I have left. Are you going to die soon? The bluntness of her question stunned us both, but Jonathan didn't flinch. Yes, Veda, he said gently. Probably in a few weeks. She considered this, then nodded as if it were a perfectly logical answer. Then we better make sure you know all the important stuff about me before that happens, she said. And that's exactly what they did. In the weeks that followed, Veda made sure her father truly knew who she was. She brought photo albums from home, showed him her report cards, taught him her favorite songs. She made him promise to watch over her from heaven the same way her mother did. In return, Jonathan told her stories about Sarah that even I had never heard. How Sarah laughed so hard at movies that she snorted. How she always ordered the same thing at restaurants because she was afraid to try something new and not like it. How she had the softest heart for stray animals, homeless people, and anyone who needed help. She sounds like you, he told Veda one afternoon as she sat coloring at his bedside. Kind and brave and smart. Grandma says I have her eyes but someone else's nose, she said. You have my nose, he replied quietly. Veda touched her nose thoughtfully. It's a good nose. I think so too, he said, smiling. 3 weeks later, Jonathan died peacefully. Veda and I were there, along with Dr. Reeves and a nurse who had grown fond of our daily visits. Veda held his hand and told him she loved him and that she would take care of Grandma for him. The funeral was small, attended mostly by his business associates, most of whom seemed surprised to learn he had a daughter. Margaret, the woman he had married all those years ago, came and spoke with me afterward. She was gracious and sad, and she told me she was glad he had found Veda before the end. He was different those last weeks, she said. Happier, even though he was dying. You gave him something he didn't know he needed. 3 days after the funeral, Jonathan's lawyer called to go over the will. The meeting was held in his downtown office. Mahogany furniture, leather chairs, and the quiet efficiency that always seems to surround big money. Mr. Whitmore was very specific about his wishes, the lawyer explained, laying documents neatly across the conference table. The bulk of his estate, approximately $200 million, will be held in trust for Veda until her 25th birthday, with Mrs. Morgan named as trustee. The number still didn't feel real. $200 million. Enough to guarantee that Veda would never have to worry about rent, groceries, or medical bills the way I had for the last 8 years. However, the lawyer continued, there are some conditions. I looked up, immediately on guard. Even from beyond the grave, part of me expected Jonathan to still be trying to control things. The funds are to be used solely for Veda's benefit, he said. Education, medical care, housing, reasonable living expenses. Mrs. Morgan, you are also provided for with a separate trust of $10 million to ensure you are never financially dependent on Veda's inheritance. $10 million. For me. More money than I'd ever even imagined having. Enough to stop cleaning houses forever. Enough to finally be the kind of grandmother Veda deserved, instead of one who was always exhausted and worried about bills. There's one more thing, the lawyer added, reaching into his briefcase. Mr. Whitmore asked me to give this to Veda personally. It was a small jewelry box, very much like the one that had once held Sarah's watch. Inside was a delicate gold locket with an inscription on the back. For my daughter, with all my love. Dad. Inside the locket were 2 tiny photos, one of Sarah, young and laughing, and one of Jonathan from around the same time. That evening, when I fastened the locket around Veda's neck, she looked at herself in the mirror and smiled. Now I have both of them with me, she said simply. Yes, I said, you do. Grandma, are we rich now? I paused, trying to figure out how to explain $200 million to an 8-year-old. We're comfortable, sweetheart, I said at last. We don't have to worry about money anymore. Good, she said. Can we buy real food for the kitty behind our building now, and maybe take her to the vet? I laughed, realizing that even with a fortune in her name, Veda's priorities were the same as always. Help who needs help. Take care of others. Be kind. Yes, sweetheart, I said. We can definitely take care of the kitty. 6 months later, we moved into a house in a good neighborhood, with excellent schools and a big yard where Veda could play. But we kept our old ritual. Every Sunday, we visited Sarah's grave with fresh flowers and updates. We told her how Veda was doing in school, how she was taking piano lessons now, how she had decided for sure she wanted to be a veterinarian. She found her daddy, Sarah, I told the headstone one autumn afternoon, while Veda carefully arranged daisies in the vase. It wasn't the way any of us would have chosen, but she found him and he loved her exactly the way you always believed he would, if he ever got the chance. Sarah's watch now sits on Veda's dresser in a place of honor, right beside the locket her father left her. She's still too young to wear the watch, but she likes to hold it sometimes while she does homework or reads before bed. It tells time backward, she said to me one evening, turning it in her hands. It goes from when Mommy had it, to when Daddy had it, to when I have it, like a story moving through our family. That's when I understood. The watch isn't just jewelry, it's proof. Proof that love survives, even when people make terrible mistakes, even when life tears families apart, even when time runs out too soon. It's proof that sometimes, if you're very, very lucky, life hands you a second chance to do the right thing. And sometimes that's enough. Now I'm curious about you, the one listening to my story. What would you have done in my place? Have you ever lived through something even a little bit similar? Tell me in the comments. I read them, and they mean a lot to me. And while you're here, on the final screen, I'm leaving you 2 more of the channel's favorite stories. I'm sure they'll surprise you. Thank you for watching until the end.